Good afternoon. My name is Tom Nastic, Public Program Producer here at the National Archives in Washington, D.C., and it's my pleasure to welcome you to the William G. McGowan Theater, and a special welcome to those of you who are watching us on the National Archives YouTube channel. Today, our series of noontime author lecture and book signings continues with a special program in honor of Father's Day, First Dads, Parenting and Politics from George Washington to Barack Obama, with our guest, Joshua Kendall. Before we get to today's program, I'd like to tell you about two upcoming programs that will take place in this theater as well as on our YouTube channel. Tomorrow night, Thursday, June 16th at 7 p.m., the National Archives joins with the National Women's Party at the Belmont Paul Women's Equality National Monument to present a panel discussion, the Equal Rights Amendment, Yesterday and Today. This program is presented in conjunction with our exhibit, Amending America, currently on display upstairs in our Lawrence F. O'Brien Gallery. Then our public programs take a little hiatus as we prepare for our annual July 4th celebration, but we'll be back in this theater on July 19th when author Eric J. Dolan will discuss and sign his book, Brilliant Beacons, A History of the American Lighthouse. To find out more about these and other programs, exhibits, and events at the National Archives, please consult our monthly calendar of events. There are copies out in the lobby of the theater, and it is also available online at our website, www.archives.gov. Joshua Kendall is an award-winning journalist with work in the Wall Street Journal, Los Angeles Times, New York Times, USA Today, Psychology Today, and the Boston Globe, among other publications. In addition to First Dads, he is the author of The Man Who Made Lists, about the creation of Roget's Thesaurus, The Forgotten Founding Father, a biography of Noah Webster, The Lexicographer, did I pronounce that right? Lexicographer responsible for Webster's Dictionary, and America is Obsessive, which features biographical profiles of 7 American icons, including Thomas Jefferson and Charles Lindbergh. After his talk and Q&A, Mr. Kendall will be signing copies of his book, One Level Up, outside the Archive store, and needless to say, it makes an excellent Father's Day gift. Please welcome Joshua Kendall to the National Archives.
Hi, Tom. Thanks for the introduction, and it's a pleasure to be here in Washington. I was here at the Library of Congress about a month ago, and on that trip, I left a copy for the president. I gave it through a press aide. And to get you in the spirit of the talk, I said to President Barack Obama, America's best first dad, though, as you will discover, the competition isn't particularly keen. In general, the news isn't so good. USA Today review said, father knows best, except when he's the first dad. The men who have gone on to become president typically are not family men, although there are some exceptions, some very sweet dads, like Obama and a few of his predecessors. When we think of the presidents, we typically think of, especially when we learn about the presidents as school children, the presidents are like statues. They're people up on Mount Rushmore. And then maybe when we take history courses in high school and college, we learn a few things about them we don't like, and then maybe we start denigrating them. And there's sort of this tension among historians and also among everyone to see presidents to either idealize or demonize. And I really want to capture the complexity of character. And the way in for me is to look at them as fathers and how they treated their children. And I want to give readers a feel for what it was like to have dinner with the president or to spend a weekend with the president. And I really want to highlight their decision-making process. And if you can understand how they decided how much time to spend with their children, how to interact with their children, you can also learn about their approach to policy. And James David Barber, a leading political scientist in the 1970s, as he put it, the issues will change, but the character of the president will last. We tend to think of presidents as lists of policies, but I want readers to come away from this book thinking about the president as human beings who came up with policies. Now, information about presidential families is not that available for two reasons. The families have often tried to protect themselves against people like me who might be snooping around in the archives. I was at the Massachusetts Historical Society in Boston, where I live, and some critical letters between John Adams and one of his sons are missing, and most historians believe that those letters were destroyed. Also, historians have tended to ignore presidential families because they think it's just squishy stuff. Who really cares what the dinner conversation was like or what the fathering experience was of a particular president? And I want to argue that the fathering experiences of presidents are critical to the course of American history. And just to give you a few examples, I have a chapter in the book about grief-stricken dads, presidential fathers who lost a child. One was Calvin Coolidge. In 1924, as Coolidge is about to run for a term of his own, his son, Cal Jr., cuts his toe on the White House tennis court, and he dies a week later from sepsis. It's the type of thing that would be treated an hour today. And when Coolidge dies in 1933, Dorothy Parker of The New Yorker says, "How could they tell?" That's in reference to the fact that after the death of his son, Coolidge starts taking these long afternoon naps and sleeping as many as 11 hours a day. He's really kind of out of it, and I argue that this depression may well have helped cause the Great Depression. Before 1924, he was a dynamo, and he was in charge. There was an earthquake in Japan, and he was one of the first national leaders to respond. But after the death of his son, he was a changed man. He told an aide, "I always see my boy playing tennis on the court out there." That's where his son, Cal Jr., cut his toe.
Could you speak a little louder
Okay.
and more into the mic?
Okay, maybe if I lift it up, is that better? Oh, I'm sorry. I should have tried that. All right. So I was talking about Cal Jr., and if you think about this election of 2016, I wrote a piece in the New York Times in October. This election has also been affected by a politician who lost a son. Joe Biden would have been running against Hillary Clinton this spring if he hadn't lost his son, Beau. So the point is that the fathering experiences of presidents are part of our history, and they can't really be neglected. A little bit about my method. It's nonpartisan. So we've had some excellent Democratic dads, some excellent Republican dads, some lousy Democratic dads, some lousy Republican dads. And I really want to stay away from contemporary politics in terms of endorsing any candidate, but just to take the long view of history. There have been 43 presidents, 38 had biological children, the other 5 adopted children. One of those presidents who adopted children was George Washington. And this is actually critical to our history because if you go back to the 1880s, the last thing that Americans wanted was a monarchy. We had just fought the Brits, and the last thing we wanted was to establish our own monarchy. So in a draft of his inaugural address, Washington notes that he's a safe choice for president because he has no biological children of his own, and he's unlikely to pass on the reins of power to a family member. I divide the presidents into 6 buckets, so I don't go chronologically, but I go by fathering type. The largest bucket is the preoccupied dad. Now, these are dads who are obsessed with politics. As Lyndon Johnson famously put it, I think about politics only 18 hours a day. And how else do you get to be president unless you're pretty consumed by politics? So that's a large category. Jack Carter, Jimmy Carter's eldest son, said, Dad's driven, Dad's been one track. And so that's a kind of typical pathway. But there are other types of presidents. Another category is playful pals, presidents who connected with their children primarily through play. The most famous example is Theodore Roosevelt. Another chapter is on double-dealing dads. These are dads who fathered illegitimate children. Grover Cleveland, if you remember the election of 1884, he admitted to fathering a child out of wedlock. Warren Harding is another double-dealing dad. Recently, there's been DNA evidence in that case, and there are also a couple of surprises, which I'll talk about later. And the 3 other categories are tiger dads. So I borrow this concept from the Yale law professor Amy Chua, who wrote that bestseller, Tiger Moms. Dads can be very tough, too. An example is John Adams. He told his son, John Quincy, when he was growing up, you're either going to be president or you're going to be a failure. John Quincy lived up to the challenge, but his two brothers didn't do so well. And then John Quincy did the same thing. He was also a Tiger dad. He has a son who's 30th in his class at Harvard out of 75. And then John Quincy says, well, no Christmas vacation for you in Washington. You've got to stay at Cambridge and study. And then he kind of changes the goalpost. When the son is about 10th in his class, he says, I'm not coming to your Harvard graduation unless you're in the top 5. So this is a very tough dad. And then the other category, two other categories are grief-stricken, which I've already alluded to, and then nurturing. There are sweet dads. Obama isn't the only one. Harry Truman's daughter, Margaret, described herself as a total daddy's girl. And what's interesting is that the book also charts the evolution of fatherhood. And in the 18th century, fathers really weren't expected to do diapers. I mean, Obama, I argue, is probably the first president to do diapers on a regular basis. In the 18th century, fathers were expected to be providers, but there's still some sweet dads going back to the 18th century. James Monroe, for example, was one. In each chapter, I talk about 3 presidents in depth, and for those presidents, I've interviewed family members. I talked with Lucy Johnson, LBJ's daughter, or Chip Carter, Jimmy Carter's, one of his sons, or I go to the archives like the Massachusetts Historical Society. But I do try to say something about all 43 presidents. And for example, in case you were curious, Chester Arthur, James Garfield's vice president, who became president upon his death, was a playful dad, and he raised a polo-playing playboy, his son, Arthur. All right, to get you in the spirit, I want to show you some photos. This is FDR with his eldest child, Anna. And FDR is an interesting case. He's a preoccupied dad. He's thinking about politics all the time. And he's very different as a father than as president. The public and private are different. John Adams was a tiger to the country and a tiger to his kids. He's the one who gave us the Alien and Sedition Acts. He didn't like opposition, political opposition, and he was kind of a loner. FDR is kind of divided. What's so interesting is that when FDR dies in 1945, most Americans felt as if they had lost a father. He was a protective figure who somehow got us through the Great Depression, got us through the Nazis, got us through most of the war with Japan. But to his own children, he was very different. He gets polio in 1921, and he's literally leaning on his children. Let's see, I think, yep, he's leaning, and when he makes his political comeback in 1924 at Madison Square Garden, the Democratic National Convention, he's leaning on his son, James. And he leans on them not only physically, but also emotionally. The part that comes out with his children is this kind of needy part that requires nurturing. His children are parentified. They take care of him while he takes care of the country. So this is his eldest son, James. Is it coming out? And is that all right? Can I speak here? Okay. This is his eldest son, James, who's holding him up, and there's Anna. And also his children are caretakers of him in many ways. In 1943, Anna moves back to the White House, and she's the one, she may well have kept FDR alive for a couple of extra years. She's the one who notices that he has a very serious heart condition, which his doctors aren't taking care of. And she also micromanages his schedule at Yalta, and she's very careful not to exert him too much. So his children kind of take care of him so that he can take care of the country. And all right, here's Jimmy Carter. This is Jimmy Carter's wife, Rosalind, and his mother, and that's Chip Carter and Chip Carter's first wife. And I spoke with both Chip and his first wife for the book. And here's Jimmy Carter today. This is a photo that Chip gave me. If people alive in the 70s all remember Amy Carter, and they forget that Jimmy Carter had 3 sons. So that's Chip next to Amy, and then that's Jack and Jeff. And Jimmy Carter in 1974 was on What's My Line, remember that show? And no one knew who the hell he was. He was a governor of Georgia. And he's the first person to take the Iowa caucuses seriously. And the reason he could do that is that he had these 3 sons, then all in their 20s, and the 3 sons were all married. So he had a campaign staff of 6. And this family would go around the country, and that helped him win the Iowa caucuses. So again, that's another instance in which the fathering experiences of a president have made a huge difference. Without this family, Carter never would have made it to the White House. All right, Franklin Pierce. Remember I talked about the grief-stricken dads. Harry Truman, by the way, called Franklin Pierce the most handsome president. Franklin Pierce was a dashing senator from New Hampshire, and a tragedy hits him in January of 1853. 2 months before he's about to be inaugurated, Pierce takes the train from the Boston area back home to New Hampshire. The train crashes. His 3rd and only surviving son, Benny, dies. Some wood splits open his forehead. Pierce has to pick up his son with a hole in his head. And Pierce is never the same. Like Coolidge, he has, as I wrote in this New York Times piece in October, he developed some kind of post-traumatic stress disorder. And again, he's considered one of the worst presidents in American history, but I think you need to take this in context, that losing this 3rd and only surviving son in such a violent way, his brain was really fried. A week after this accident, Coolidge writes his Secretary of War, Jefferson Davis, the fellow who a decade later would be the president of the Confederacy, and he says, I don't know how I can go on. I don't know how I can do this. And he's really impaired. His wife, Jane, literally goes psychotic, and she starts writing letters to the dead children. And so just all this sadness, and I just want to highlight I highlight the sadness for a couple of pages in the book to just show that you need to understand Pierce's career in context. And without this tragedy, he might have been a president able to do something to stop the slide into civil war, which he wasn't able to do, as it turned out. And here's Calvin Coolidge's son, Cal Jr., the one who dies in 1924. And here's that tiger dad, John Quincy Adams. He doesn't look very friendly, and he wasn't. He also suffers a loss. His son, George Washington Adams, now remember I told you that John Adams said to John Quincy, you better be president? Well, John Quincy gives his son the name George Washington, so you can see where that's going. This is probably even a sadder chapter than the Coolidge and Pierce one, if you can believe it, because this guy commits suicide at the age of 28. And you can't say that his father caused it. He may have had some independent mental illness, but certainly his father's badgering made things worse. And in 1829, Quincy Adams is voted out of office, and he's ready to go back to Boston from Washington. He writes George and says, please come from Boston and help me move. George is 28. He's graduated from Harvard. He did well at Harvard. He won a fancy literary prize over Ralph Waldo Emerson. He has a lot of potential, but he's very shy and very anxious. He's also having alcohol problems, and he's fathered an illegitimate child. And he's terrified that his father is going to come back to Boston and find out that his life is a mess. So on the way back to Washington, he jumps off a ship and kills himself. And tiger dads can either kind of make a kid. I mean, John Quincy may never have become president without the prodding from his father. He has a brother, Charles Francis Adams, George does, who does very well. But tiger dads also can have a negative impact sometimes. But what's amazing, and the only positive out of this horror, is that this horror leads to John Quincy Adams' second career. If you remember that he then becomes a congressman and is a very strong advocate against slavery. And this suicide kind of wakes him up and sort of provides him with renewed energy to devote his life to something that he believes in. So, as I wrote in this New York Times article about parents who undergo loss, there's post-traumatic stress and there's also post-traumatic growth. So everyone is affected by the loss. Another president who suffers a loss is Abraham Lincoln. His son Willie dies in 1862. One of the first people to write him is Franklin Pierce. But Willie's loss somehow energizes. There is this post-traumatic growth. Lincoln says a couple of days before he dies that he's thought about Willie every day since his death. But Lincoln finds some kind of heroic part and has the sense of mission. And the mission is to bring the country together and to fight the war as effectively as he can in order to end this horror and end slavery. So Lincoln again channels that pain into something productive, the same way that John Quincy Adams does. Here's Dwight Eisenhower's son, John. And this is an amazing coincidence that as a writer just made me lick my chops. John Eisenhower graduates from West Point on June 6, 1944. And so I have a scene in my book on that day at the graduation, and that afternoon he's whisked away to Europe to visit with his father for a month. His father's a nervous wreck because Ike has no idea how D-Day is going. But Ike was a Tiger Dad, and he's in full Tiger Dad mode. So he plays bridge with John, and John's bridge game is no good. They drive around in a Jeep, and John gets some dust on his uniform, and Ike is outraged. Ike had a bad temper. They used to call him Mr. Big Bang, and he used to yell at his staff when he was president. And then he would say, well, my mother taught me how to control my temper. And then as soon as he was out of the room, they said, and she didn't do a very good job. As I said, Tiger Dads can either make or break their children. John was able to withstand it, and he became a very accomplished writer of military histories. The thing about Eisenhower, he was not only a Tiger Dad, but a Tiger Granddad. John Adams actually becomes very sweet as a granddad, and he tells John Quincy, he said, stop being so harsh with my grandkids. He softens up a bit, but not Eisenhower. And I know this because David Eisenhower, the fellow who married Julie Nixon, John's son, writes a memoir. And in the 1960s, he's working at the Eisenhower farm, at his grandfather's farm for the summer. He takes a long lunch hour, and Ike fires him. And Tiger Dads love their kids or grandkids. They just sometimes get carried away by impulses. So a few hours later, Eisenhower apologizes and says, let's go play golf. And he's rehired. But that just gives you a sense of how a Tiger Dad or a Tiger Granddad works. This is Teddy Roosevelt. So he's a playful pal. And this is a letter that he's writing to Alice, his daughter from his first marriage. Alice was very rebellious, and Roosevelt TR said, okay, Alice, I don't want you to smoke under my roof. So Alice said, okay, I'll smoke on the roof. And that's the kind of relationship they had. Remember, I said that the fathering experiences are pivotal to our history. Well, TR, first he says, well, I can either run the nation or I can take care of Alice. And he's kind of overwhelmed by Alice. But then, at the time of this letter, he says, oh my gosh, this kid is very creative, and I'm going to use her for political purposes. And in the summer of 1905, in this cute letter where he draws a little picture, and he writes about of her excellentissima, he's kind of joking with Alice. He's sending Alice on a mission, on a diplomatic mission to Japan. And the next year, Roosevelt is going to win the Nobel Prize, Peace Prize, for ending the Russian-Japanese War. So that's another way in which presidential children can be very helpful and can play a role in our history. I wrote a piece for Politico a couple of months ago talking about the power of presidential kids. And we really elect not only a president, but also a whole family. So if we go with Clinton, we're going to have Chelsea. She may do something like this one day in the next few years. Or if we go with Trump, he's got 3 kids in his 30s whom he may well send to Russia or something one day. And maybe as voters, we need to keep that in mind. And here's Grover Cleveland, who in 1884, Ma, where's my pa? He had this illegitimate child, but he acknowledged it, and he wins the election. And then he marries this woman who's 30 years younger. And I found out that he was kind of a womanizer. I found love letters to a mistress. He has a wife 30 years younger, and he's playing around on her. And Cleveland is a complicated case, but Cleveland acknowledges having two personalities. Big Steve, who was the part of him who would go drinking, and when he, in his bachelor days, was womanized, had a lot of girlfriends, and even when he was married, had girlfriends. And then he had Grover the Good. Remember, I started out by talking about how complicated people can be. And I think personally, Cleveland, is not my kind of guy. I wouldn't want him dating my daughter. But as a president, he actually was quite honest, and you could trust him with the budget. So there really was this Grover the Good. And that just shows you how the sort of idealization or denigration doesn't really work. That Cleveland had all these different parts, and that, okay, personally, not so great, but he really was, was a rather effective president, and that's why he was voted in for that second term. And this is John Tyler. Remember, I talked about my double-dealing dads. John Tyler ran in 1840. Remember, the ticket is called Tippecanoe and Tyler too. William Henry Harrison ran for president. Harrison dies after a month. Tyler becomes president. Now, that was the ticket, the most fertile ticket in American history, even if we include only the legitimate children. Harrison had 10 children with his wife. Tyler had a first wife. He had 8 children, and a second wife whom he marries in 1844. He has 7 children. So that's 25 between the two. Historians now believe that Harrison, who was from Virginia, had 4 slave children, and that there are oral histories suggesting that Tyler had as many as 52 slave children. Now, I don't know if we can believe all of that, but I think there's something to it. I think the Tyler situation is kind of where the Jefferson situation was a generation ago. There's now DNA evidence backing up the claim that Jefferson fathered 6 children with Sally Hemings. With Tyler, there's no DNA evidence, but there's very compelling circumstantial evidence, which I talk about in the book. And here's a picture of one of the alleged slave children who looks a bit like Tyler. The nose is the same. It's a small photo, but and his last biographer refers to him as kind of lusty, so he may have just had a lot of different slave mistresses, and it does seem to check out, although there's no hard evidence to date. But I just lay it out in that chapter. All right, now to go back to some of the categories. The preoccupied. I talked a little bit about, so each chapter has 3 stars. The preoccupied, I talked about FDR. LBJ thinks about politics only 18 hours a day. His daughter, Linda, is desperate for FaceTime with LBJ. So as a teenager, she starts reading the congressional record, because LBJ is thinking about the next piece of legislation. So if she figures, okay, if I can talk to him about it, he'll want to connect with me. And that just shows, and LBJ really has no idea how to connect with children. His 2 girls, one of the infants is kind of colicky, and he tells his wife, Lady Bird, go call J. Edgar Hoover. J. Edgar Hoover was his neighbor when he was a young senator. And what is J. Edgar Hoover? He's a bachelor, he has no idea. But that's just the way LBJ thought. If you had a problem, go call J. Edgar Hoover. She ends up calling a pediatrician. But it just shows you that he's so out of touch when it comes to interacting with kids. And he's thinking about politics. Another thing that Lucy Johnson told me was that he also gave her the Johnson treatment. Remember the Johnson treatment? He knows how to schmooze, and then he knows how to threaten a little bit and cajole to get a vote. And he did kind of the same thing with her. And she learned the lesson and did it with him. When she wanted something, she'd go up and give him a big kiss and say, "Oh, how handsome you are, Daddy." And she'd get an extra $20 or something. So she put it to good use. And Jimmy Carter was a preoccupied dad. We think of Jimmy Carter as very sweet and sort of peace-loving. And he has that side to him. But as a dad, he was very, very tough, particularly with his 3 sons. Remember, he was a Naval Academy graduate, and he treated his 3 sons like military underlings. He had a philosophy of spanking. He was very, very tough. When they didn't obey, he would punish them. But he did change, and I found this very moving. In the mid-1980s, one of his sons, his eldest son, Jack, came up to him one day and said, "Dad, I think you ruined my life because of your harsh parenting." Carter is shocked initially, and he pushes back and says, "How can you say that?" But then he really takes it to heart, and he's written a memoir, and he talks about how he was so pressured to start his career as a farmer and later as a politician that he automatically repeated the behavior of his own father, Earl, who was very, very tough. And Earl would say at 7 in the morning, "You want to go, collecting peanuts or something?" And Carter said, I did everything that my father said right away. And he became just as authoritarian as his father. And I was very moved by Carter's ability to acknowledge his behavior and to try to make amends with Jack and to really process his own experience as a child and to think through how he ended up treating his children. And when I was in Atlanta, I gave a book to Carter through his grandson. His grandson is a political consultant, James Earl Carter IV. He's the one who slipped the 47% tape to Rolling Stone. If you remember, there's a tape of Mitt Romney saying he doesn't care much about 47%. This grandson, Jimmy Carter now calls him the most famous Carter, was responsible for digging that out. Anyhow, I gave a book to Jimmy Carter, and I said, for America's best post-president and best post-presidential dad, because I think what he did was took a lot of courage to acknowledge some mistakes and to grieve, but also grow and reconnect with his family. I found that very moving. And just a little bit about the current candidates. I've written a little bit about the Trump family and also the Clintons. And I interviewed Eric Trump. And the reason I bring it up here is that I think that both Hillary Clinton and Donald Trump are preoccupied parents. Even though Hillary Clinton would be the first mom, she really fits into this category. Remember, they used to call Bill Clinton the first black president because he had a natural affinity for talking to African Americans and going to church. In many ways, Obama is almost the first female president. His way of relating is very feminine. He's a connector. He wants everyone to get along. And that's because the primary influence in his life were his mother and grandmother, and he fathers just as he was mothered. But Hillary Clinton is more male in her orientation toward parenting, and I think that's because women of her generation who wanted to make it big in politics or law had to be almost more male than the men. As an example, in It Takes a Village, she writes about how when Chelsea was 6, both she and Bill sat Chelsea down and told her about all the insults that were being hurled at Bill during a campaign for governor. And I think that shows her preoccupation. A more nurturing parent like an Obama would probably say, geez, the girl is 6, she doesn't need to know this. But the Clintons are really consumed by politics, like LBJ or like Jimmy Carter. And Donald Trump hasn't been consumed by politics, but he's been consumed by business. And his connection with his 3 sons is through business. Chelsea Clinton is vice chair of the Clinton Foundation, and that's the way she connects with her parents. The 3 Trump kids from his first marriage, Don Jr., Ivanka, and Eric, are all vice presidents of the Trump Organization. And Trump, like Roosevelt, he's kind of leaning on his children to kind of take care of him in the interests of helping him with his business. And I think this I think Americans love Obama as a father, but they're a little bit frustrated with him as president, feeling that he hasn't done enough, that he's been a little bit too kind, maybe in foreign policy and also domestic policy. And I think there's kind of a hunger for a more of a can-do president. And the preoccupied dads like FDR, or another example of Reagan, have been some of our best presidents, but there's kind of a risk. Sometimes they can be great, or no matter if you're a Democrat or Republican, you can understand that FDR was a formidable president, as was Ronald Reagan. But sometimes the preoccupied dads just don't know how to connect with either the country or their children. An example of that would be Herbert Hoover, who didn't know what to do in the early 1930s, and he also didn't know really how to connect with his children. He was an absentee dad, and when he was Secretary of Commerce, his kids stayed back in Palo Alto and went to high school, and Hoover's only connection to them was getting updates from paid caregivers. So he was kind of a distant dad and also a distant president, where Reagan and FDR were distant dads. Patty Davis felt very alienated from her father and wrote a roman à clef during the 1980s criticizing her father, but Reagan and Roosevelt could both connect with the country. So that's what the Clinton and Trump people are saying. Maybe our person is going to be a can-do president, but there's also a risk that person could be a little bit more out of touch than Obama has been. All right, playful pals, I mentioned TR. Other examples are Ulysses S. Grant. We think of him as this general, this hard-charging general, but he had this very soft side, and he had problems with alcohol, but I came to the conclusion that it wasn't because he disliked his family, but that he really loved his family and missed not being with them. In the 1850s, he's on a post in California, and he writes these very tender letters to his wife that kind of lapse into 21st century psychology. He says, I really miss Ulysses Jr., and my attachment to him is so strong. And he resigns from the military. He starts drinking and then resigns from the military, and he doesn't go back until the beginning of the Civil War. There's also a very touching scene in my book. His daughter Nellie gets married at the age of 18, and it's during his presidency, and it's one of the premier social events of the 19th century. And Grant is very upset because she's marrying a Brit, and that's going to mean that she's going to move to Britain. So right after the ceremony, he goes into her bedroom and cries his eyes out. And that just, again, shows you the human side of these presidents and how we tend to think of Grant very differently. And Grant was a playful pal, and he's very permissive. His wife, Julia, said, Ulysses has no idea how to govern children. He lets them do whatever they want. And that was also a problem in his administration. Remember, there are a lot of scandals in the Grant administration. He has some crooked aides, and there's this whiskey ring, and he also kind of lets his aides do what they want, and he doesn't know how to supervise them. So sometimes the parenting skills or parenting problems then seep in to the political life of the president. Another example of a playful pal who may be a surprise to many is Woodrow Wilson. We think of him as this dour intellectual, but he had 3 daughters, and he loved to dance with his daughters. And also the relation to politics, one of his daughters says to him around 1915, how come 4/5 of the family can't vote? I mean, 3 daughters and his wife, and Wilson eventually gets behind female suffrage. So again, that's a way in which the family life has been influential. And if you believe the Freudian maxim that the daughter looks for the father in a mate, one of Wilson's daughters marries the best dancer in Washington, a man her father's age. He's William McAdoo, who was the Secretary of the Treasury at the time. All right, the double-dealing dads, I've talked a little bit about Tyler, Cleveland, and Harding. One of the surprises is LBJ. LBJ used to tell aides, I had more women by accident than Kennedy had by design. And he was, and this chapter isn't about womanizing, it's about illegitimate children. And there's a woman who wrote a memoir about 20 years ago with some canceled checks. The son died in his 40s, but the evidence is pretty compelling that he fathered an illegitimate kid with that mistress. Also, one very loyal aide whom he hired out of college in 1962, who stays with him through 1969, told a biographer recently that as soon as she came to the job, LBJ offered to set her up in an apartment in New York City if she would bear his child. So that's just very compelling circumstantial evidence for the other woman's memoir. And this is a loyal aide who stayed with him for 7 years. And there have also been some allegations in other cases, and I just review the evidence. George Washington may have fathered a slave child, but that one is sort of 50-50. People just don't know. So in the chapter, I just kind of review what's known and what's considered likely in terms of presidents having children out of wedlock. All right, Tiger Dads, I've talked about Adams and Eisenhower. What people forget about Eisenhower is that he was an amazing physical specimen. Remember, he goes to West Point, and he was on the Army football team, and he was a middle linebacker, and I think they called him like Cyclone Ike. I forget the exact name, but he had this nickname, and he once tackled Jim Thorpe in a football game. And John says that his father never hit him, but if he had, he would have killed him. And that John says that he was born standing at attention. Because we think of Ike today as kind of a doddering golfer when you see those images from the 1960s, but he was very imposing physically as a dad, and plus very critical of John. And then the grief-stricken, I wanted to mention a little bit about JFK. So I talked about Pierce. So Pierce and Coolidge were both kind of broken by the loss of a child, but it can go either way. Remember I talked about Lincoln losing Willie, but Lincoln kind of digs deep inside and finds this kind of heroic part that becomes this amazing Civil War leader. Another example of a president who loses a child is William McKinley. He loses two daughters in his 30s, and his wife then suffers a stroke, and she's an invalid for the rest of his life. And that kind of becomes McKinley's brand of this tender husband who shares this sadness of losing his only two children. And that, as with Lincoln, that energizes him, and that's what motivates McKinley to run for Congress in 1876, and that's kind of his brand. When he's running for president, people just really like his character because he's a good family man. And his wife went a little bit crazy. I mean, she would talk in the 1890s when McKinley was president. His wife would talk sometimes as if the daughters were still alive, and his wife was totally fixated on the daughters. But McKinley himself was able to process the loss, and it sort of, McKinley there's kind of analogy with Roosevelt and polio. Many Roosevelt biographers have said that polio kind of made Roosevelt the politician, that he became more sensitive and more empathic in the wake of that health crisis. And the same seems to be true of McKinley, that he became this leader and a very sensitive husband out of this tragedy, as opposed to Pierce and Coolidge, who were broken by the tragedy. And another example of a grief-stricken dad is JFK. JFK loses his son Patrick at 1 day old in a couple of months before he dies. And he goes to Massachusetts General Hospital a few blocks from my house and holds Patrick's hand as he dies. And then right after that, he ducks into a supply closet and cries his eyes out. Now, JFK wasn't a double-dealing dad, but he certainly was a womanizer, and his marriage was on the rocks in 1963. But out of this tragedy, he became closer to Jackie and started to rededicate himself to his family. And I think It just, again, it's another reason why his assassination was so sad. It seemed to sort of bring him back to the importance of his wife and his children. So I want to end on a little bit more positive note with the sweet dads, because as I hinted at the beginning, the story isn't pretty, but there are some nurturing dads. Besides Obama, Rutherford B. Hayes, president in 1877, he's the guy behind the Easter egg roll at the White House. He was a very sweet guy, and like Obama, he fathers as he was mothered. He never knew his own father, and he had a nice mother and a sister, and he has a feminine way of interacting with people, very caring. He was a Civil War general, and he was very gentle with his soldiers. You know, when they were dying, he would just make sure that they were taken care of. And Hayes, very sweet with his own children. And one day in around 1878, a kid comes up to him, a street urchin here in Washington, and says, "Sir, can we roll our eggs on your lawn?" And Hayes says, "Okay, let me look into it." And he says, "Sure." And that's how it got started. And today, that's the biggest event at the White House every year, the 30,000 kids on the president's lawn. And then Harry Truman was very sweet. And remember, so Margaret, his daughter, wants to become a singer. And Bess Truman says, "No, this is 1940s America. Come on, you got to go get married. None of this career stuff. Go get married and have some kids." And Harry says, "She wants to become a warbler. Let's let her become a warbler." And then you all probably remember that in 1950, she gives a concert here in Washington, Constitution Hall, and she gets viciously attacked by a Washington Post music critic by the name of Paul Hume. Truman is an early riser. 5 a.m. the next morning, he's fuming. He writes a letter to the editor basically saying he wants to chop Hume's block off for attacking his daughter. Most of the letter gets printed. His aides are horrified. They say, "Mr. President, look what you've done. You've just created a disaster." And Harry says, "Let's look at the mail." And the mail comes back 80-20 in favor. And the American people feel like he's protecting his daughter. That's not such a bad thing. And Margaret feels cared for. She said, "I'm glad chivalry isn't dead." And remember that I'm trying to connect parenting and politics. So I just want to show that in Truman's case. Truman's biggest decision as president comes in August of 1945, when he's got to decide, do I use the bomb against the Japanese? And I believe that the same thinking went into that decision that went into the Paul Hume letter. Because Truman wasn't a violent man, he wasn't a warmonger, but he loved his daughter and wanted to protect her. And I think that's the same way he felt about American boys. His generals were telling him that if we don't use the bomb, 200 to 250,000 boys are going to be killed in the next year using conventional weapons. And Truman's thought, and this is the decision-making process that I alluded to at the very beginning. My sense about Truman is, look, you Japanese, if you're going to go after my boys, I'm going to have to nuke you. Just like kind of nuking Paul Hume. If you attack my daughter, this kind of protective anger. It wasn't a violent act. It was just, I'm not going to allow these young men to die. I'm not going to allow Margaret to be turned inside out. So that's kind of the link to policy. And again, I'm just trying to get inside the heads of the presidents. And I hope this also, this is a Father's Day gift, and if you give it to a father, you can say, you're definitely better than John Adams. But that, it will also make us think about, our own parents and our own parenting, and to give us a sense of, what's going on inside our heads, and that we're all human and we have the baggage from our past, and sometimes if we have nice parents, we're just reproducing nice things, but if we have a tiger dad in our history or a tiger mom, that can be reproduced easily. So I'm hoping that this book will teach you about American history in a new way, and will also help you reflect about parenting and about the ties between the generations. All right, I think I want to stop there. I'm happy to take questions.
ladies and gentlemen, if you have questions, we ask that you go to the microphones in the aisles so that we get it on the recording.
Thank you. So the title of the book, First Dads, at a certain point, as I thought about it, made me think of the people who were the fathers to the presidents, which is the case for a couple of our presidents. So I was wondering if you had come across anything in your research about the fathers of the presidents in addition to the fathers being presidents.
Yes. The Jimmy Carter example that I spoke about, that he had the very harsh father, but also, are you also interested in maybe the Bush's father, George Herbert Walker Bush, obviously father to president, and I have some thoughts about that. What's so interesting is that George Herbert Walker Bush was a grief-stricken dad, because after George W. is born in 1946, he has a daughter, Robin, who dies a few years later, and that's when Barbara Bush's hair goes white. And the reason I'm bringing it up is that has a huge impact on George W., because that's when George W.'s clownish side comes out, because he's trying to humor his mother. He's just so scared to see her so depressed. So George W.'s grief leads to, George H.W. Bush's grief leads to sort of a core component of George W., and with his two girls, Barbara and Jenna, he's very playful and clownish. So that's one example of, so this would be the father of George W. I do, like Eisenhower had a very tough dad, and so a lot of the Tiger dads, particularly the Tiger dads, had very tough dads. I'm also suggesting that the models for fathering are kind of tough. I mean, the book also documents the evolution of fathering, and in the 18th century, John Adams wasn't that, was pretty mainstream, that fathers were supposed to be providers, and they were supposed to help their kids find their way in the world. None of this diaper business, none of this play business. It was very, very serious business. If you think about it, the verb father, even to this day, only refers to procreation. It doesn't refer to caretaking the way mother. When you think of mothering, you think of putting the kid to sleep, but that meaning really isn't connected to the word fathering. So this book documents the evolution, and Obama is a nurturing dad, and I think there'll be more nurturing dads in America at large, and also in the presidency in the centuries to come. But as I mentioned, there were a couple back in the 18th century. James Monroe was quite sweet, and then in the 19th century, Rutherford B. Hayes. So again, there are a lot of presidents there. I've just given you a few examples of the fathers of presidents, or how presidents dealt with their own parenting, but certainly comes up. And in each of the longer profiles, I try to allude to the modeling that particular president got. And an interesting case is George Washington, whose father died when he was about 11. And George Washington had a very critical mother. When he's a general during the Revolution, his mother is sending him nastygrams and is spreading rumors that he's neglecting her. The poor guy's at Valley Forge freezing his keister off, and his mother is spreading all these rumors. And when Washington adopts Martha's children, he decides that he wants to be the exact opposite of his mother. So his mother teaches him how not to parent. So that's also a reaction that some presidents have had vis-a-vis their fathering or their mothering. If they didn't like it, sometimes they do the exact opposite. So there are all kinds of ways that people in general, and presidents in particular, can process the parenting that they've had. Okay, any other?
On this side here, on your left.
Yep.
Thank you for the talk. Just a couple questions in regards to how you came up with the idea, the time it took to get to where you are now, and your research process. Were these letters that you'd find? Obviously, a lot of things are very personal. How did you come across the things that you did?
All right. It took me about 2 years, and as I said, I did about 20 of the presidents in depth. And for those, I would go to the Presidential Library, or I went to the Truman Library and read a lot of letters between Harry and his daughter. And some of those letters are published, but then I could go to the library and supplement that. And then for the 20th century presidents, I tried to speak to as many family members or aides as I could. I spoke with Truman, one of Margaret's sons. Margaret had 4 children, and he would tell me interesting stories. His name is Clifton Daniel, the same name as his father, Clifton Daniel Jr. Harry loved music, and he had an ambition to become a great piano player. And he gives Margaret a piano when she's about 10. And Margaret likes music, but ends up switching from the piano to the voice. And Clifton told me that his mother gave him a piano at the same age. It's just kind of cute how those stories are passed on. I also spoke with several of FDR's grandchildren. I spoke with Ellie Seagraves, who was just 5 years old, and when her grandfather was inaugurated for the first time in 1933. And then for 19th century presidents, I would head to the archives. And there are a lot of letters that are around. For Franklin Pierce, I just stumbled. I live in Boston, where there are great archive libraries. There's the Mass Historical Society. There's also the Harvard Houghton Library. And I just went to Houghton. It has a lot of presidential letters, and I found this amazing letter that Franklin Pierce wrote just a couple of days after the accident, where he sort of spills his guts about how devastated he was. But there are also a lot of letters between, especially days before the telephone, there are a lot of letters between the fathers and their children. And how I got to this idea, my last book was called America's Obsessives, in which I profiled 7 American icons who were control freaks, starting with Thomas Jefferson and going through Steve Jobs. Thomas Jefferson was an amazing thinker and an amazing president. He was reelected by about 75% of the vote in 1804. But as a dad, he was so-so at best. He was a control freak, so he told his daughters what to do, what to wear. He gave them a schedule. And that kind of gave me the idea of thinking about how one leads a country and how one leads a family. And remember that until very recently, fathers were really the head of the household. So even though mothers could be very involved in the child rearing, fathers sort of dictated household policy because they had all the power, until women could work outside the home and bring home some bacon too, so their opinions could have equal weight. Oh, go ahead. Yeah.
Did you interview any of the presidents themselves?
I wasn't able to. I tried to interview President Obama, and Jimmy Carter is not only a preoccupied dad, but he's now a preoccupied author. He's 90 and he's on his 30th book. And I guess President Obama, he's carving out 5 nights a week to have dinner with Malia and Sasha, so that probably doesn't leave much time for reporters like me with book projects. So, unfortunately, I wasn't able to. Yep.
Did you find any first dads that were different political parties than their sons?
Yes. Franklin Roosevelt had very rebellious sons. His 5 sons, they would smash up their cars, and 4 sons and a daughter. Those 5 children had 19 marriages, and one of them became and a couple of them became diehard Republicans to sort of stick it to him. One was actually a columnist for the Hearst newspapers during his presidency, but Roosevelt was very good-natured, and he didn't argue. He didn't like to be disagreeable, but he did say that one of the worst things in the world is being a president's child, and maybe that was a quick allusion to how frustrated and angry he was with all their rebelliousness, including the decision of a couple of them to support Republicans. All right. Well, thanks so much for coming, and